So, because Napoleon had done so well in Italy, like I said, he was then sent to Africa to go handle the British. And the British are pretty powerful at this time. But Napoleon, being Napoleon, he he saw a lot of opportunity in Egypt. So when Napoleon is given the mission or the objective of going into Egypt, he not only takes his military, he takes historians, archaeologists, he takes all kinds of people because he knew, historically speaking, that there were a lot of treasures and things to uncover and, valuable things that were there in Africa. So he basically goes not only with his soldiers, but he goes with, all these other people. And their job is to basically uncover and basically steal or take any kind of historical artifacts they can take while they're stationed in Egypt. So just to give you an idea here, we know that he started out in France. He then was successful in Italy, and then he was sent to Egypt down here to fight the coalition forces. And if you look back at this picture right here, of course, that's Napoleon and the Sphinx. There's these kind of legends that he was fighting amongst the pyramids and things like that. So what happens is, Napoleon, while he's there, just continues to prove why his men kind of love him. He fought amongst them, but he also really tried to make his soldiers feel important. So, for example, he really tried to get to know their names. And anytime they did something good, he would make a big deal about it. So, if a fellow soldier had done something that day that had been really amazing and helpful, he would kind of gather everybody around and say, look at what they did. I'm so proud of what he did to help us out that I'm going to take the medals off of my own uniform and place them on his uniform as a gesture. Now, what people really didn't realize all the time was that he carried a whole pocket full of medals with him so that he could give accommodations to people on the battlefield. But what this does is it gets his soldiers, his men, to love him, and they respect him. And it's a good thing because in Egypt, he finds a lot of trouble there. Now, while he's there fighting, he does come into contact with the British, and the British were good. And they were led by someone, this name is important, a guy named Horatio Nelson, okay, actually ends up leading a portion of the British forces in Egypt. And if you've ever heard the term the wrestling term to be put into a full Nelson or a half Nelson, this is kind of where we get that. So he ends up, fighting Nelson, and he loses. And for Napoleon, this was not something that he was necessarily used to. And he also knows that once word of his loss gets back to France, people are going to have a totally different opinion of him. And he was afraid that, the people of France would believe that he was a loser and he wasn't, fit to have a high rank and things like that. So what happens is Napoleon actually convinces his men to keep their loss out of the public newspapers in France. So his men really didn't even write home and say they had lost their major battle in Egypt. And what that does is it helps to keep Napoleon's popularity going in France, because most people kind of had an idea of who Napoleon was after he had saved the Directory. So his popularity remains very, very high, even though he loses the Egyptian campaign. Now, even though the Egyptian campaign is a loss for him and it's a win for the coalition, there is one thing that Napoleon does get credit for. His archaeologists actually uncover the Rosetta Stone while they are in Egypt. And for those of you that don't know what the Rosetta Stone is, it is this ancient tablet here that has basically 3 different languages on it. and it allows us to actually like decipher some historical documents and things like that. It helps us translate languages that we don't really understand today. So Napoleon actually gets credit for that, and this is one of the many things that he takes back to France with him. To put into museums and things like that. And a lot of those are still there today, including the Rosetta Stone. So one other thing that's happening while Napoleon is in Egypt is his wife, because he was married by this point in time, his wife, Josephine, who was kind of like a socialite in France. She had been married before to someone who was pretty wealthy. She had 2 children from her previous marriage. Her husband had passed away. So Josephine, his wife, while he's off fighting in Egypt, she's basically like kind of hitting the party circuit back in France and like talking him up. She's really trying to get in touch with like members of the government, the Directory, the National Convention, anyone who has any kind of power or authority in France. She's basically trying to like use her persuasive abilities to like talk Napoleon up and say, he's doing such a great job. He's protecting our country. He definitely deserves some kind of recognition for that and some kind of promotion. So when he gets back from Egypt, the decision is made by the Directory to name him as the overall commander of the French military. So he is given the entire French military as a reward for basically doing a good job. And this is exactly what he wanted. He was very manipulative. He was a planner. He wasn't dumb. He also wasn't that short. If you've ever heard people talk about like a Napoleon or a Napoleonic complex, short little guy who's angry, always has to prove something. We kind of paint this picture of Napoleon to be this tiny little guy. He really wasn't. He was probably like 5'6", 5'7", which was actually normal height for a male in this time period. We've just kind of changed that into something else as history has gone on, as a way of highlighting some things. So anyways, he is given this responsibility. And again, it's exactly what he and Josephine had planned. So in 1799, November of 1799, Napoleon is brought into basically the National Convention, and the Directory is there, and they name him as the overall commander. And now all of the chips can fall into place because, this was exactly part of his plan. So he's been given control of the entire military now. He has a great reputation within that military. And literally the next day, so the very next day, Napoleon walks into the building where the Directory and the National Convention are meeting with armed guards and basically says, "I'm taking over." He says, "You're out. I'm disbanding you. You're done." And, the French public were actually really pumped about this because they didn't trust the Directory. Food prices were still out of control. There were still problems. The things that had been there in 1789 are still there now in 1799. And Napoleon walks in with armed guards and carries out what we call a coup d'etat, a swift overthrow of power. And he just walks in and he says, "I'm in charge now." He says, "We're redoing this. You guys aren't doing your job." And they had to back down because he had the military behind him and they respected him and they were going to do whatever he wanted. So in November of 1799, Napoleon takes over. But he tries to kind of hide it to make it look like he's not just taking over as a dictator. He says, "Okay, we're getting rid of the Directory. We're getting rid of all this stuff. Instead, we're going to create the consul." And the consul, or the consulate, was a group of 3 men that were going to run the country. Of course, Napoleon himself is named as first consul. We know now that, what he was doing was just making it look like he was being very diplomatic and, maybe democratic in a way. But, that's not what was happening. He was acting as a dictator when he did this, and he took over. people of France aren't mad about it. They had erupted in a revolution and killed their king and killed a lot of people because they didn't want one powerful person in charge. And here's a guy who walks in, takes the power for himself, and everyone's like, yay. One of the reasons they are okay with this, we know he was popular, right? He had military victories against the coalition. He had the respect of the military. But what happens is once he is able to take over as first consul, he is able to stop the fighting with Great Britain and Austria. He basically creates a ceasefire. And there were other countries that had joined the coalition at this point. So by 1802, okay, 3 years into his rulership, there's no fighting. He has stopped the fighting with the coalition. And, the people of France recognize that and they respect him for it. But there's so much more to this story. They just don't quite see what he's doing. And we're going to talk about that later.